I'll be speaking now to issues of corporate governance in the broader context of public governance in continental Europe, and also setting a little bit of context to help explain why we see some fairly systematic differences between continental Europe and the Anglo-American world, particularly in terms of the relative status of organized labor. Not so much in terms of their direct impact on companies through, for example, industrial action, because we've seen pockets of significant industrial disputation historically in the UK and even in parts of the US economy. And indeed, comparatively, we look at statistics, we'll see that actually the United States actually has higher rates of unionization than some European countries. What is significant is the extent to which, though, labour interests and broader social interests are protected by state regulation, which imposes then restrictions on business. So we'll be talking more generally about whether there is a general social democracy orientation, and that's a term that I'll come back to, in contrast to a more, say, economic liberal orientation in the Anglo-American world. First thing I want to say, though, straight away, is that there's actually very considerable variation within Europe itself, and even within regions in Europe that we tend to think of as very similar, such as Scandinavia. We see Denmark, for example, has fairly liberal labour markets where it's relatively easy for firms to hire people and to fire people as well. But the social welfare system then supports people through going through the process of, say, economic restructuring, losing their job, needing to get training and whatnot. So there are some differences even between Sweden and Finland within this Scandinavian example. And then, of course, when we look across the large expanse of the European Union, we see very significant differences. I can only speak to a few of the major European historical examples here, and to some degree I'm paralleling the discussion that's in the textbook there, particularly with the rise of large corporations in Germany, and setting that to some degree against the French and the Italian experience. The primary focus here in this presentation is actually on the governance context itself. I'm not doing like I did in the British context and setting the broader history of industrialization, for example. So start off with a map. This is from the Heritage Foundation, which is a little bit of a controversial organization in the United States in the sense that it tends to be very, very economically liberal. It's a useful reference point because we can see that even amongst radical economic liberals in the United States, there is a very clear recognition that some of the economies that viewed, say, from Japan, look very much as social democratic societies such as Scandinavia, show up as having very high levels of economic freedom. Indeed, we'll have a whole separate week where we'll focus very specifically on Nordic capitalisms and note, for instance, there that actually they have very high rates of new enterprise establishment, startups, and in fact the rate of startups is even higher actually than the United States. So I just want to briefly note unemployment, and the critical point here, of course, is that there's very significant variation across economies, and this is mirroring, of course, the long drawn-out effects of particularly the global financial crisis and how it impacted on some European economies quite intensely, and on the other hand, some economies felt little direct impact, and indeed are characterized by very significant labor shortages. So we see, for example, Czech Republic, Germany, Poland, they've had very strong economies. So prior to COVID, they were in a very positive dynamic growth-wise. On the other end of the spectrum, of course, we see Greece and Spain, Italy, all economies that were very hard hit in 2009, 2010 by the GFC, the global financial crisis, and a knock-on banking crisis and public finance crisis, particularly in the Greek case, and was very politically contentious. But even fully a decade on, we see that still unemployment's rate was still very high in Greece. Also, that overall headline figure, particularly say for Spain, downplays to some degree the particular concentration of unemployment amongst younger people. And so there's been very, very significant economic impacts there. It's been very tough for people who are university graduates over the last decade to get a start with their careers. And so EU and EU mobility presented some opportunities for people to go and seek employment elsewhere. Britain was particularly popular, and of course with Brexit that has significantly complicated things. Slide's a little skew-if here, excuse me, let me adjust this a little. Okay, so I've touched on, with my opening comments here, on social democracy. Now, social democracy is, as a term of phrase, it's typically used to describe a very moderate left-wing set of policies. So if we think of communism and then socialism, and then social democracy gets quite close to supporting a market-based economy, and some societies we see very strongly embrace the dynamism of a free market economy. But it also holds that a combination of action at the corporate level, particularly in the form of trade unions that represent employees' interests and articulate employees' interests to management, sometimes explicitly incorporated into decision-making structures, even on the boards, for example, of companies. You might have trade union representatives in some cases, such as Germany. And also government policies to provide decent public welfare, for example. That kind of welfare may take the form of obviously very good public health systems, but also, very importantly, education systems that are easy to access, often free, and provide an opportunity for people who may lose their job to have retraining, for example, so that they can find an alternative career. So we see that there are various models of social democracy in Europe, and when we particularly focus on the Scandinavian instance, we'll see a particularly refined example, or series of examples, of a basic model which says embrace the disciplines of the market, but have the state backstopping, as it were, individuals in order to make sure that no one is a long-term victim of the kind of structural adjustment that naturally you get with a dynamic market economy. Now, sometimes the social democracy becomes a qualification to free market economics. It leads to arguments that sometimes the state should proactively intervene, for example, in the market for corporate control to slow down or maybe even stop takeovers, mergers, acquisitions, for example, that might lead to employees losing their jobs or having their benefits cut back and whatnot. One of the complicating things in the European context is that the EU structures as a whole impose certain restrictions on national governments regulating the flow of capital. So cross-border takeovers, for example, of one company in Europe by another European company, strictly speaking under EU rules, should not be stopped. Now, we see in practice sometimes European states have endeavoured to do this. But let's step back first of all and ask ourselves why this notion of social democracy has become so widespread in Europe, relatively more so than we see in certainly the United States, arguably the broader Anglo-American world, although when we look closely at Australia and New Zealand, for example, in the context of discussing settler capitalisms, we'll see that the very strong labourist traditions there have a great deal in common with the social democratic orientation in Western Europe. Well, a key initial starting point when we talk about capitalist systems in Europe is to recognise the historical legacies of war. Histories of revolution, of class conflict, of course the French Revolution, and various periods where, although governments weren't necessarily overturned, there was radical class conflict. Particularly 1848 was often described as a year of revolutions or a year of failed revolutionary attempts. And we see here that states responded in various ways. They either got very tough on labour movements and on radicals and took a strong authoritarian turn, or they endeavoured to incorporate the more moderate representatives of the rising labour movement, for example, into the political process. Sometimes this was through providing social welfare means, even if it didn't mean extending the vote, for example, to all workers. And so we see that Germany, particularly a unified Germany after 1871, makes a various range of moderate concessions to try and subdue hostility to the new nation state that's being built, which is very strongly supporting industrialization, and which of course brings a whole range of social costs, as we saw in a similar context in Britain with the Industrial Revolution. Of course, post-war Europe, post-World War II, with the enormous destruction of World War II, we have seen in that context a very strong sense that social peace has to be considered a prerequisite for economic development. A very strong story took hold after World War II that the tragedies of Nazi Germany, the rise of the Nazis to power in Germany, initially through a democratic process, although the Nazis never won a majority in an election, but they didn't win the largest number of seats in the National Assembly, in the Reichstag in the early 1930s. And in a complex kind of process, Hitler came to power. But the Nazis, along with the German communists that they suppressed, both had sought to take strong political advantage of urban unrest, of dissatisfaction in the context of post-World War I Germany, with inflation, high levels of unemployment, and then subsequently the deflationary pressures that emanated then from the United States in the early 1930s. So there has been a very strong sense after World War II, never again. And this has led to a twofold thing. It's been to try and secure domestic peace within particular societies. So social welfare mechanisms are one way of accommodating that, to diffuse potential class conflict, and particularly in the context of the Cold War, standing against the Soviet Union and the broader Eastern Bloc until 1989. And at the same time to try and promote a degree of economic integration of European nations so that never again would they fall into the kind of tragic conflict that you had in World War II. So associated with social democracy, we see particularly strong legal protections of employees. This is a critical feature. Now, there is no simple relationship, though, between high trade union membership rates, strikes, social welfare policies. There's considerable variation across different sectors of the economy. There's varied institutionalization of labour interests. Sometimes we see, for example, when labour interests are very much represented through state policy, which requires companies to look after employees in many ways, involving them, for example, in consultative processes, that may lead to actually low rates of unionism because simply people are no longer battling through strike action, for example. Alternatively, you may have very high rates of trade union membership, but very low rates of strike action. And this is where the unions are so normalized, so institutionalized in the governance structures of the companies that it's instinctively natural for people to join the unions, but there's a very low impost for doing so, and it doesn't lead to strikes. And this is pretty much what we see in the Scandinavian countries. And we can see some statistics here will give us a sense of that. 90% of all employees are in trade unions in Iceland, for example, 2/3 in Sweden, about half in Belgium, a bit over a third in Italy. Very notably, France, with all its reputation of strikes, and if anyone's been trying to catch an Air France flight and had it frustrated by striking workers, as I've had, the rate there is only 7.9% by at least this statistic. Now we've got a different statistic over here on the slides, and we'll see a little bit of variation. Depends on how you count it. France shows up at 11% there. Strikingly, Germany, fewer strikes than France, actually, by any measure, has a significantly larger number of employees in trade unions. So trade union membership in itself doesn't necessarily lead to radical strike action. And we see exactly the same thing in the Japanese context, where many people in large companies, particularly who are core employees, seishain, union members, but we don't have many strikes in Japan. In fact, I can't remember a strike in the last decade here in Japan. We have a table up here in the top right-hand corner, which looks roughly at it's a bit old, latest figure is 2013, the average level of protection of employment that is through state laws. And Portugal, of course, has become more liberal. We can see in the decade between 2003 and 2013. But all of them tend to have more restrictions legally upon companies just simply firing people than is the case in the United States. Now, I want to speak very briefly to the notion of corporatism. This is a common term we hear in the description of capitalisms in Europe, particularly in the German context. The idea here is that national representatives of employer and employee organizations come together with state representatives to negotiate compensation outcomes. Now, this can be at the national level or it can be at the industry level. So it implies not just at the company level, but at a national level, a societal level, representatives of organized labor and representatives of companies as a whole, so national bodies representing corporate interests, are coordinating with the state to some degree. And why is this meaningful? Well, it means that the state, for example, may encourage unions to be more moderate, to not go on strike at the company level, for example, in return for the state being strongly committed to a decent social welfare system. Now, sometimes these consultative processes are actually compelled by law at the company level. We see in Scandinavia organizations above a certain organization, they must have a formal consulting mechanism with employees. And effectively, managers, though, when they know that trade unions, they have to talk to trade unions, they are going to respond in some ways too, particularly if there is a danger of significant industrial action. If the trade union representatives are sitting down negotiating over salaries and conditions, and it's getting highly conflicted, then obviously managers have an incentive to try and hide as much information about the profitability of the organization, to cry poor, like quite literally, and to say, look, we can't afford to give your membership a wage increase this year, so bear with us. So we will see one of the consequences of this is that anything which reduces the transparency of the financial state of a company sometimes is attractive if you're under pressure from organized labor. And I've previously mentioned in the context of the United States in particular that listed companies are a little bit vulnerable in terms of negotiating with their own employees, because if it's a publicly listed company, the profitability of the company is made starkly clear because they're reporting their financial condition to the market as a whole. Now, I want to speak briefly to nationalizations, so kokoeka, taking private companies and then making them state-owned. So this is when the state takes them over. We have seen in the past a very severe interventions in the sense the market for corporate control, even indeed actually not exactly a vibrant market of corporate control, literally intervening to take over enterprises, typically paying compensation to the shareholders. Sometimes this was, as we saw in the British case, businesses, owners of businesses that maybe had severe capital constraints, were not that profitable, sometimes are quite happy to be taken over by the state. Very often what happens is that companies that are considered critical to the economy, providing key infrastructure or maybe manufacturing capability that either employed a lot of people, so it was politically sensitive, or manufacturing capability that was considered very important for national interests, such as military equipment and whatnot, that as a private business it's failing, so the state steps in and effectively takes it over, sometimes saves the owners from their creditors. If it's, of course, on a limited liability basis, then the law itself would have done that. So we've seen similar kind of things in the Japanese context, where effectively there is a kind of temporary nationalization sometimes that goes on for quite a while, where the government has stepped in to bail out an enterprise to keep it going, either because it was considered strategically important or because, of course, it employed a lot of people. So as I say here, this often arose in response to the declining financial health of firms with large capital needs that were particularly vulnerable to hold up by militant employees. One other way that we ended up with nationalizations was actually right at the end of World War II. This is a very significant thing, that businesses that were seen to have collaborated with occupying German forces, for example, in France, ended up being nationalized. This is Renault. Renault, the car company, was a private company. After World War II, the French state accused Renault of having chosen voluntarily to take contracts supplying the Germans with trucks in particular. And this became a pretext for then the French state taking over the company. And still today, the French state is a significant shareholder, and this has been an issue actually in its relationship, its partnership with Nissan as well, because the French state has a veto over things that Renault can do. Now, it's actually much contested whether it was fair that it ended up in state ownership. In some other contexts, in Norway, for example, we see some firms that were effectively under German control, and then after World War II, with the German defeat and the restoration of Norwegian independence, these enterprises then became state-owned enterprises. So when we have state-owned enterprises, we typically have managerial elites, sometimes have been to fancy business schools or public governance schools that also have to teach what we would think would typically be taught in more business schools, for example, Sciences Po in France, School of Political Science, but also teaches a lot of managerial, indeed marketing-oriented classes, because we have quite a tradition post-war France of certain key state-owned enterprises being run by managerial elites who sometimes move back and forth between the state and the private sector. And we see, particularly in the French case, there was a deliberate series of nationalizations under the Mitterrand government in the 1980s. So actually the state became significantly larger as a player in the economy. Often nationalized enterprises turned out to be nowhere near as efficient as the state originally thought, partly precisely because trade union demands for higher wages, for example, not just are an industrial or a business negotiation, but they become a political negotiation because ultimately the state owns the enterprise. Now, one thing we need to note here is very significantly that the share market and the size of the share market, and particularly the number of companies listed in Europe, is significantly smaller than in the United States. And I've already hinted at a reason that, first of all, we have some significant wealthy founding families who keep control. Secondly, many of these companies were subject to pressures from trade unions, as I said, organized labor, and also tax regimes and whatnot and a general political environment has meant that wealthy owners of companies like to keep a low profile, and for various complex reasons, maintaining private ownership of a company rather than publicly listing it and selling some of the shares and retaining some as a partial block shareholder, for example. All of these things would be potentially very costly and also to some degree politically risky for entrepreneurs. So what we see, this is the percentage of world market capitalization 2019, just before the COVID epidemic, and we see that over half of total share market capitalization is the United States. Japan is about 70%. And if we look at the European instance, what's really striking is how small places like Germany are and France are. These have some very big world-class companies, and yet the share market themselves is not very large. So these really big famous companies are very often not listing on the stock market at all. Now, when we look at brands, that's another thing we'll come to. We'll do a bit more of a dive at the brand level, at the individual company level here, just to have a look at total capitalization and just get a sense of companies where they are, okay, relative to economies. So what this has done, this overlays several large American companies against the size of the GDP of particular economies, okay? Oh, sorry. Correction, the total capitalization of the domestic stock market and the equivalent US listed company. The other one I had in mind I chucked out. Okay, so we see that the entire Swedish stock market, for example, is equal to Berkshire Hathaway, pretty famous investment fund, and Bank of America put together. The entire Finnish stock market is something akin to the market capitalization, so the total value of all the shares. So what you do is you take the share price multiplied by the number of shares on issue, and that gives you market capitalization. So McDonald's and Disney together equal to something akin to the Finnish share market. Alphabet, and as the parent company to Google, is roughly akin to the entire Spanish stock market. Now we turn to brands, and what we notice, if you can look at these yourselves, you see that actually Europe has lots of very valuable brands. Now some of the top American brands still are outsized there, but many very striking brands. Louis Vuitton, for example, worth $40 billion there, quite a number of them. You can dive into them yourselves, but you realize that effectively what we have is lots of very valuable brands, but the stock market doesn't mirror this. So many of these companies, such as IKEA, for example, are just privately held. They're not listed on the stock market at all. Now, I've said that managers have a certain interest in not putting information in the market about the state of their finances. That's not to say that the accounting itself isn't transparent, because we have very sophisticated states, of course, who hold companies to high accounting standards, partly so they can tax them effectively, okay? Partly because it's just very good managerial practice. So account keeping is quite sophisticated, but firms' financial statements are often not transparent to either outside parties or even stakeholders like employees. So management deliberately avoids open disclosure of the firm's financial position, really is in a detailed way, because they want to avoid further demands from labour and other stakeholders when the firm is doing well. Now, if you're a very large shareholder, you can still get information on the status of the company. Effectively, you schedule a meeting with management and they tell you, okay, this is where we are financially, please don't sack us, okay? We're looking after your interests, but we're just not going to tell everybody else, because if we tell everybody else, people want to come and shake us down. Our employees want more, governments start leaning on us to do more things. You know, we want to close a factory and move some production to China, and we're trying to tell the government, hey, please don't, pressure us into not doing this. Jobs are at stake here because we can't afford to manufacture in Germany anymore. But then if you show that you're really profitable, that story doesn't have much credibility. Another factor too is that, of course, limited disclosure makes a hostile takeover rather more risky for acquirers, because you just simply don't know how to value an enterprise. Well, a takeover is only going to happen if you're publicly listed. So this is the case of companies that are on the stock market, but effectively don't want to be up for sale. One other striking difference with the United States is incentive compensation. We've touched on the previous set of slides here. So large incentive compensation, the kind of things like stock options and whatnot that we've spoken about, very rare in continental Europe. And even though you don't get very large managerial compensation, very high salaries for your top managers and bonuses and whatnot, still they tend not to reveal what managers get paid. So they tend to keep it quiet precisely because it gets politically contentious. And indeed, when stock options have been introduced, even though relatively small, there's often been a lot of criticism of this, as we saw in the German case. Generally, left-wing governments have strongly opposed incentive compensation. They make the argument, it's an interesting argument, that, well, your average ordinary worker goes to work and is expected to do their best, so why shouldn't managers too? They're fully compensated parties. Of course, in the American context, it was this problem of fragmented shareholders, leading to this question of whether shareholders have ownership without power, the very famous expression. And as a consequence, the strong incentive compensation mechanisms are to encourage managers to think like shareholders. Of course, the European perspective is that, well, yes, if managers think like shareholders and are incentivized in that kind of way, that further divides them from the employees that they're managing on a day-to-day basis, and that's not a socially desirable thing. That's the general perspective. On the other hand, the elite status of management in firms is rewarded and reflected in other ways. We see in France, for example, unlike in Japan, it's not uncommon for top executives to have very considerable privileges, private dining rooms, for example, very clear status distinctions between elite course management employees and the broader working membership of the company, the employees of the company. Now, although it's true that France has a much smaller stock market relative to the size of its economy than the United States does, or even Britain does, historically France actually did have a very strong securities market. If you see the Bourse in Paris, and there's a subway station right nearby and whatnot, this was a grand institution. We've read a little bit of the history of it in controversial terms in our textbook. And the stock market was very vibrant in 19th century France. Historically, the state was conservative. It was pro-business, and famously and notoriously, the state would often support entrepreneurs, business owners, in their battles with employees. So we see some very significant suppression of strikes with state power, for example, in industries that were considered to be either critically important, such as, say, coal mining, or just simply the business community was very strongly politically connected, and they were able to convince state elites to help them suppress trade unions who they argue were militant, socialist, and threatening the fabric of society as a whole. Now, strike action, in many ways, people think in Europe, if you think France, we tend very much to associate it with strikes, partly because of the very public nature of strikes in critical sectors that impact railways, for example, airlines. Notably, many of the strikes have actually been public sector employees resisting cutbacks in benefits conditions, work conditions, pay freezes and whatnot being imposed by the French state. So we have this image of militancy, and at certain historical junctures, this was definitely the case. It was very famous, for example, in 1968 during the student movement, that there was also a significant strike at Renault. And so there was this notion of workers and students uniting, and we've seen several other historical junctures where strikes have been very intense, even quite recently. It's not uncommon, for example, for managers to be effectively taken hostage in the headquarters of the company And in one prominent instance a couple of years ago, some manager was stripped down to his underwear and had to do with a kind of walk of shame to get out of the head office. And of course his car was trashed as well. So very strong sense of militancy there. And one of the implications here is that you see as a consequence a certain defensive business culture, business people, limited expansion, family block owners, recruitment of managers within the controlling family. And at the same time in France you had the development of elite universities, the Grandes Écoles system, that created top officials for the public sector, but also for the private sector. And we see the establishment of some business schools were actually very much promoted by the chambers of commerce. For example, what used to be EM Lyon, École de Management Lyon, which is now Lyon Business School, that was established with the very strong support of the Lyon Chamber of Commerce. So elite business being well organized to foster the development of educational capability for bourgeoisie and for the kids of the owners of the firms themselves, who would then help to run these businesses and grow these businesses effectively. We see a similar kind of thing in Italy as well. Bocconi Business School, for example, quite renowned business school in Milan, unusual in being a private institution, and had very strong support from the business community. In the French case, after World War II, security markets just didn't develop fully, and we have little separation of ownership and control. So the major shareholders are very much directly involved in influencing, directly managing companies. So there's been a long-standing debate within France and beyond, particularly within France, about is there a very distinctive French model of capitalism? And many would, in France, tend to set the French business and French system, at least rhetorically, against the ostensibly the American model of basically being able to fire people more easily, but being very hard-headed and closing factories if need be, downsizing and whatnot. But sometimes I think that's actually a substantial exaggeration. There was a very famous book about effectively the American threat, written in the late 1960s, that argued that the French way of life and whatnot and established enterprise was in considerable danger of being surpassed by American companies. It was a book that a lot of people cited, but I think not many people read. The author actually recognized that there were certain problems in the French system and that there could be lessons learned from America, but it was taken, on the other hand, to be more of a call for a defensive response to an American competitive threat. Now, former president of France, President Sarkozy, once made the observation, when asked about a French model, he said, well, to speak of a French model implies, or to speak of any model implies that someone wants to actually copy it. And he said he was not going to get into any conversation about a French model until someone could demonstrate that actually someone was trying to copy the French example. So maybe it was a bit of a joke in a way, but there is a fundamental point there that by definition every society has its own particular combination of institutions and practices, but does it internally cohere? Could it be replicated? Is it just an historical kind of accident? Is it very meaningful to talk about a model per se? Let's turn briefly to the German case. And I just identify a couple of different kinds of German companies here for a very simple reason, that This has certain implications for corporate governance and particularly the status of employees in relation to them. The German stock market I mentioned is already rather less developed. Most notably, listed companies, when they are listed on the stock exchange, they tend to have one large block shareholder. So there's much less full separation of ownership and control than we see in the Anglo-American world. Very heavy state intervention in corporate governance to protect and empower employees, and that this increased further in the 1970s. There's systems of work councils that help to set employee wages and conditions in consultation between the management and the union. And this notion of codetermination, the right of employees to be kept informed and to participate in decisions affecting them. This was formalised in 1976, and it gives a third of the seats on the firm's supervisory board to employees in smaller companies, and up to 1/2 of all seats in larger companies. So that sounds an astonishing thing from a Anglo-American perspective, that half of all board members would be union representatives. And one would think, well, how could you ever make a tough decision to downsize the company, to close a factory, for example? Well, in reality, what companies do, and this is a really important point I want to emphasize, that when the state intervenes to constrain enterprise, business owners, business managers don't stand still. They respond in creative ways to try and attenuate, to reduce some of the constraining impacts. So what we see is in Germany, effectively, is there is a dual board system. So there is this supervisory board where Labour has its representatives, but then day to day there is a managerial board, and this is the focus of the senior managerial team, and it doesn't have direct employee representation. And of course, they try and avoid having as many supervisory board meetings as possible. So unlike the, at very least, monthly board meetings of Anglo-American boards, they'll meet only a couple of times a year, for example. And effectively, they try and share as little information as possible. So we have seen then, of course, more state responses. Back in 2002, there was a code that actually required that financial statements should be published in advance of, for example, a shareholders meeting, and should be made available to Labour representatives. So it's kind of like mogura tataki, bang a mole, not whack a mole. So effectively, you get restrictions being placed on management to enhance, say, workers' interests, and then effectively they try and come around, the management comes up with some kind of workaround, and then more regulations to try and stop that. This is a similar kind of mechanism as writing tax law or anything else. People don't stay still when effectively there are new regulations or new forces working against their own interest. So reactions to codetermination. So effectively what we see, block shareholdings are at least in part a reaction to power of Labour in the firm. Now, what do I mean by this? What I mean is that if you've got lots of fragmented shareholders, no one has, say, more than 1 or 2% of the shares in a company, management's not going to feel a great deal of governance discipline from the shareholders. So if they're faced by a quite militant union, say in the French case, where a very militant union, for example, they've taken you hostage effectively inside the headquarters, and maybe your beloved car is about to get seriously bingled, end up looking like a golf ball, you're kind of tempted to run fast and loose with the longer term shareholders' interest and really promise the union what they want to get some peace and quiet. Okay, to have an easy time as a manager. It's nice if the radical union is kind of placated. You buy them off. So in order to make sure that shareholders' interests are not simply traded off for management's day-to-day ease of working life, we tend to see shareholders being larger, much larger, and therefore able to discipline managers. It's a bit of a chicken and egg thing, what comes first, of course, but one of the arguments is just simply that that's often made, is that being a minority shareholder is nowhere near as attractive when you've got block shareholders in the first place, and particularly if there were large numbers of minority shareholders, they would have all the coordination problems of disciplining management in the face of all of these other societal pressures, including trade union pressures, for example. So, as I've said already, board meetings tend to be fewer, information sharing tends to be less, and so you get more kind of out of boardroom governance. And arguably this is how many large Japanese companies came to be too, with shareholders meetings being brief board meetings, although more regular, very large boards, that effectively most of the decision making was taken outside of the board. It was very much a kind of a nemoashi preparation, doing advanced preparation, preparing the routes, as it were. And then simply the board meetings become a formality. So what we see is that, yes, maybe powerful shareholders become a counterweight to powerful organised labour and the state pressuring companies to some degree, because they can politically push back. This is not very good for minority shareholders. Therefore, minority shareholders are much more limited, and also in many European cases, the law is less developed in terms of protecting minority shareholders' interests in relation to block shareholders. So you feel that, well, I don't want to own just a few shares in a company, but just run in the interest of just a few powerful shareholders. On the other hand, banks sometimes have a voice in the firm, not just because they lend to the company. Typically, if you're paying your interest on time, the banks should not have a voice in governance. But in the German case, for example, the way it can work is that if you do buy shares, you can deposit your shares in companies, in German companies, with a German bank. And so the German bank effectively is like a stockbroker for you. So they will hold the shares, and then they tally up all the voting rights associated with those shares. And so rather than individual shareholders voting them, as would be the case if you're buying shares through a stockbroker, for example, and then you're on the share registry of the company, that the bank holds your shares, and then the bank has all the voting rights for all of those shares, and they become a stakeholder in corporate governance. Let's turn briefly to the Italian case. Italy is very interesting in that it's been a very, very dynamic economy in parts. There are significant regional stories here. Particularly northern Italy has been very dynamic in terms of its industrialization, but also networks of very large numbers of smaller enterprises that are very dynamic, very innovative, but relatively smaller scale. So we see this around the fashion industry, for example, large numbers of fabric designers, clothing firms, leather goods makers, and whatnot. A very strong artisanal base. So, of course, most famously around Milan, where you see things like the furniture industry, for example, but also pockets of significant innovation, competitiveness in the clothing, the fashion industry, and say Napoli. Napoli's long been a centre of particularly men's tailoring, so ready-to-wear suits, for example, and very, very, very high-quality premium boutique brands. Many of them not known to you unless you're actually particularly into Italian, say, menswear, for example. And at the same time, we see the rise of manufacturing in certain areas around in the north, around Torino. Turin was a significant centre, for example, with Fiat. We see aircraft manufacture and many other boutique manufacturing at a smaller scale as well. So Italy did have a corporatist experience under the fascist regime from the 1920s to 1943 under Mussolini. Ended up very badly for Mussolini. Ended up being killed and hung upside down by his feet publicly, and that had been an ally of Nazi Germany, and then the Germans invaded northern Italy to try to shore up their defensive position when the Americans invaded through Italy. So very contentious. In the post-war era, we see some very interesting cases. Italy had one of the largest communist parties in the democratic world. Actually, Japan had a significant one too, still does have representation in parliament. And at the same time, what is very striking in Italy, of course, is because it's a strongly Catholic country historically, we see more conservative, moderate right-wing political parties as a counterweight to communism. But a very significant thing is that there's a social democratic, some would argue almost a socialistic, at least a communitarian social democratic orientation to a lot of Catholicism. So this idea that community should prevail over the anonymous forces of the competitive market, for example. So neither communists nor Catholic are lining up to proactively create the Anglo-American style regulatory architecture of a liberal market economy. And yet you do have a lot of very dynamic Italian entrepreneurs. And of course, we see this very strikingly, how effectively brand Italy was built post-World War II through things like the fashion industry, through food-related exports, then of course the tourism and design, particularly centered on northern Italy, furniture, for example. So a wide array of dynamic, effectively more and more premium branded product that also boosts brand Italy, developing through significant entrepreneurship after World War II. Very often the loci of governance of these is actually quite local. So you have regional governments in Italy, and also city governments, and then chambers of commerce. And so we see, for example, in Tokyo, the Italian Chamber of Commerce works quite closely, as much as possible, with the Italian government, and the office is literally around the corner, very close actually to Chaos Mita campus. But also they work particularly, the Chamber of Commerce works particularly closely with several of the regional governments. So not all of the regions of Italy are equally represented in their market making and promotional country of origin, or regional country of regional origin brands in terms of projecting abroad to boost business. So we see lots of enterprises, and many family-dominated enterprises, but weak institutions of market governance. We don't have a Securities Commission, for example, until 1974. And only in 1990, and very much under EU pressure, did Italy actually gain a Fair Trade Commission. Now, one of the reasons for this, though, is precisely because of the relative fragmentation of Italian industry. You don't get large-scale manufacturing enterprises which are just completely dominating one sector. You know, Fiat was a very large player, but it always had some competitive pressures, particularly when it's in the EU, from German and French car manufacturers, for example. So to some degree, there was less of an imperative in the first place for a antitrust commission. Also, there was some state provision, state-run enterprises, where in other countries they were run by the private sector. So issues of the abuse of market power were through the political process, because effectively they were state enterprises. Nonetheless, it is quite striking that you don't have this antitrust or competition commission until 1990. What is very clear in the Italian case is that where there are publicly listed firms, they tend to be controlled by key block holders, typically associated with founding families, and complex structures of ownership, partly for tax reasons, partly to maintain dominance over the company, even when they don't necessarily have a majority of the shares. One of the problems here is that this can be very much at the expense of minority shareholders. You get related party transactions, for example. So the key shareholders in a company make sure the company is run in a way that serves their particular interests, particularly their broader business interests. Excuse me. I'd like to cut that out, but it's a nightmare to then have to kind of re-render it all just for one quick edit. So please bear with me on that. Okay. So, of course, when minority shareholders can be taken advantage of, you're less likely to be a minority shareholder in the first place, okay? So sometimes what we see is that larger minority shareholders, so someone taking a few percent shares, for example, they might have direct contract-based protections against the large shareholders. So that's quite an unusual thing, but it also speaks to the fact that Italy is still a law-abiding society. So as a consequence, you can protect yourself with these kind of contracts. Now, there's a small typo here. We should say non-transparent accounting has both weakened the market for corporate control and the tax regime. Italians themselves often say that it's tax evasion is a national hobby, and that only fools pay tax. But there has been increasingly vigorous attempt by tax authorities in Italy to go after prominent identities and scare other people into paying tax. But Italy has systemic problems of public indebtedness, so the diminishing tax base is one of Italy's ongoing problems. So briefly, I just want to revisit what I mentioned early on in this presentation. Of course, the EU process, creation of a single market for capital, for goods and services, and for labour, okay, for mobility of workers as well. So merger and acquisition activity has become significantly increased in that context. So, of course, with free product markets, this increases competition. So companies want to get larger scale, greater efficiency. And then the removal of intra-European capital controls makes it easier. Yet we do see that some countries have resisted a free market for corporate control. And sometimes they use social provisions, and there's always a danger of ending up in courts, legal action over this, where in fact a European state can be challenged legally for interrupting a takeover bid, for example, from another European country. So hostile takeovers have historically been quite rare in places like Germany, and when they happen, there are quite strong negative reactions. So if a foreign firm was to come in and take over, that would be even more contentious still. But for the most part, a lot of the M&A activity has been the other way. That what we've tended to see is that particularly German and French firms, for example, have been acquiring their weaker counterparts in southern European states. Sometimes strategic partnerships or partial takeovers and whatnot don't work out as well as people expected. Alitalia, for example, the Italian airline has gone bankrupt under the pressures of COVID, and that's being relaunched despite a past partnership with other European airlines. So we see some countries that generally very much embrace foreign investment, open to foreign investment, nonetheless still have rules in place that effectively require takeover bidders to communicate, sometimes even get the approval of key stakeholders, particularly employees. So the Netherlands has this. By the way, if you look at where foreign investment flows to in Europe, Luxembourg's is off the charts. That's because of particularly low tax rates. So formally, a lot of companies are headquartered in Luxembourg, but in reality, most of their operations are in other parts of Europe. The Netherlands also offers relatively low corporate tax rates and easy establishment of companies. So we see that many Japanese companies formally have their European headquarters in the Netherlands. So some broader challenges in the European context, and particularly this multi-layering of governance, where you've got EU level governance, you've got national governments, sometimes regional public governance, and then of course you've got corporate private governance. One of the biggest challenges, of course, is greater product market competition, of course, recession, and we've had COVID having a significant impact on European economies, lots of liberal fiscal policy and monetary policy, which is helping to overcome that somewhat. But effectively, when you've got intense competition and you've got recession, this reduces the rents available. So the spare cash to use to buy people off, available to both managers and employees. So this means that tougher decisions have to be made. And so distributional issues come to the fore. There will be losers as well as winners. When an economy is going rapidly, you can kind of buy off the losers by being very generous. When it's shrinking, or when the financial resources of a company is shrinking, that's more difficult, and you have to make hard-headed decisions. There is wider acceptance in Europe of some benefits of an Anglo-American style corporate governance. Partly because there is more and more recognition that with retirement incomes crisis and whatnot, that you want higher returns on financial assets, particularly because people have to live off investment income once they retire. And as a consequence here, and this is my second large slide here, that there are looming retirement income crises in Europe, compounded by the increased indebtedness of so many European states, with significant expansions of public budgets in response to the COVID pandemic. Hence, a strong recognition of the need to encourage private investment and also better financial returns on those investments. And what we see, though, with the GFC, the global financial crisis, and the aftermath, the banking crisis and whatnot that came on, that those public finance and banking crises caused a lot of controversy. The legacies still continue in places like Germany, Italy, and Spain have never fully recovered. There has been some balance sheet repair with the banks. Public sector indebtedness declined a little bit, but has blown out again. So there's a real paradox here that those public finance and banking crises were reminders of the need for change, but also made it more difficult too. Made effectively people politically very aware of the distributional issues. Still, it's a very a raw nerve. There's some very sore wounds politically around Germany's very tough position in relation to Greece, for instance, and some very significant debates, particularly in the context of Brexit, about who gains from Europe. You might remember we started the course with discussion of varied outcomes, and I showed that really striking slide that over several decades, exports as a percentage of GDP for Germany more than doubled. And this was partly because Germany could take advantage of the single European market to export its manufactured goods, particularly automobiles, but a range of other manufactured goods too. And also because being in the Eurozone and with a number of weak economies meant that the euro did not appreciate at anywhere near the same rate that Germany would have experienced if it had retained the Deutschmark, because effectively Germany would have been a massive net exporter. It would have had massive capital inflows, and its currency would have risen dramatically, and as a consequence Germany would have been actually less competitive. So Germany benefited doubly through being in the EU, but Germany also was the toughest in terms of resisting substantial bailouts, for example, to the Greek government during the crisis there of 2010-11 roundabout. So advantages and disadvantages in terms of giving labour strong legal protection and influence in corporate governance. So what we see is that managers' interests align less with shareholders and more with employees. Now, this increases what we call managerial agency costs. We've touched on in other classes. Large shareholders can protect their interests somewhat through informal governance and direct participation in management, but minority shareholders can suffer. As a consequence, there are fewer minority shareholders. And this also means that there's less institutional demand for investments, opportunities in shares in companies, and so overall the share markets are smaller. So this means that the broader and deeper equities investment markets are foregone, and that's an issue with aging populations. And we see this, that's one reason why the US share market accounts just before COVID, and probably even more so now, 54% of global market capitalization is the US share market. And so much foreign capital, European capital, flows into the European share market looking for higher returns. On the other hand, the fact that Labour does have very strong legal protection and influence upon companies in Europe means that there's relatively high levels of trust between employees and management. And this can lead to higher productivity and long-term growth. Germany is a very clear example of this. And we will talk subsequently about the Scandinavian case, and we'll see that very strikingly in Sweden, for example, very strong levels of trust from even the union leadership in many companies in the commitment of management to looking after employees, even when there's a lot of technological change. So companies may replace particular manual work with a machine, for example, but the companies undertake to retrain the employees so that obviously then they can use the machines or the software or whatever, or they can have other roles within the company. So as a consequence, the representatives of Labour are not going to resist a whole range of productivity enhancing moves by management in Swedish companies. So trust is something that's very difficult to put a price on. It's also something that's very fragile. But I think the proof is in the pudding that a number of these European economies, including France, that on paper at least seem to be much more restrictive of managerial and entrepreneurial freedom, actually have been very effective in developing export-oriented, internationally competitive industries and being able to pay very high wages, and also employees have been able to bear paying pretty high taxes as a consequence. So in return, they're also getting a very good social welfare system. So, as I touched on with the Sarkozy comment about if no one's trying to copy you, can you say you're a model? This is an ongoing debate, though, models of capitalism. Intense debate in Europe today. A lot of distributional issues arise. Remember that basic model that says that the state will provide a safety net for people who lose out within the market system. It makes a lot of sense. However, there's a really inherent problem with the EU in the sense that once you remove the barriers to labour mobility, because this is a critical premise of the European Union, that not only is it about freedom of trade in goods and services and freedom of mobility of capital, but freedom of labour, then effectively this raises questions of, well, are all outsiders to be beneficiaries of the welfare system as well too? And so we see contention, even places that have a very liberal reputation, such as Denmark, for example, where more right-wing political parties recently lost an election, replaced by Social Democrats, but still a coalition. And partly the Social Democrats actually embraced restrictive policies on immigration from outside the EU, where you've got this model of high taxes, a very generous social welfare system, and it raises questions about, well, if people suddenly turn up from outside the nation, and maybe their family or themselves haven't contributed to up until now in terms of paying for the social welfare system, should they be immediately able to access the benefits of it? And so this was very contentious in relation to the issue of refugees, large numbers of refugees, particularly with the Syrian conflict in Germany. Much of the critical commentary around that was around this issue of not just integration of people with different cultural backgrounds and whatnot, but probably more fundamentally, that this social democratic notion that the state is there for everybody was politically more defensible when there were very tight national boundaries. When you remove those boundaries, that's when it becomes more contentious. At the same time, very strong sense of external competitive pressure. Historically, the fear of Japanese competition helped to drive politically European integration. These days, people aren't really afraid of Japan, and actually major economies, particularly places like France and Germany and the Scandinavians and whatnot, all see Japan as not so much a rival, but actually a significant market opportunity. Of course, profound challenges from China. So competitive pressures from all over the place, though, compound debates about models of capitalism, where effectively it's a high-cost location, but there's high levels of trust, good talented labour through good education systems and whatnot. Business will argue that the high tax rates and high costs of doing business in Europe put them at a substantial competitive disadvantage. Now, this can be debated, and it is heavily debated. But in that context, invariably complex issues of what actually are the foundations of sustainable economic development over time, sustainable competitive advantage over time, continue to be discussed. So many people make the observation, for example, that, well, Europe is obviously not competing in terms of its cost of labour, so it's knowledge economy centred, and European states heavily fund university systems, for example, and very open systems, and so the knowledge economy is the property of all society-wise, and as a consequence, if business keeps threatening to leave the home base, then maybe it's either not credible or it's irresponsible. These are very complex debates, but it goes to the heart of what are the foundations of a long-term competitive advantage for businesses based in countries that have a very high standard of living and therefore very high cost of doing business as well. Now, just finally, of course, digital disruption. People are talking about this all over the place. I just simply put this slide here to emphasize that we see, unsurprisingly, some of the smaller economies were some of the fastest in terms of uptake of all aspects of the digital economy, including, of course, developing of human capital, training of people with the skill set necessary, and the integration of digital technology, and particularly digital public services, are very substantial. So if we look at the top ones here on this ranking, Finland is the first, Sweden, the Netherlands, Denmark, interestingly the UK comes up very strongly, and I'm sorry to say Romania comes up last on this particular measure from the European Central Bank. So there are lots of issues here. France has been an interesting one in that it was a very early mover. It actually, long before other states were thinking about it, it was rolling out kiosks, for example, where people get access to public services and whatnot through digitally. But their whole model was actually a kind of a monopoly state provider. And many people have made the observation that France has been a little bit cursed by having moved a little bit too early, but in a very elitist, state-centered kind of way, whereas many smaller economies were much more open to just simply taking the best of what dynamic markets were offering internationally, and particularly coming out of the United States, embracing it. But also just simply want to emphasize that particularly strikingly in the Swedish and the Finnish cases, it's not just that they were quick to take in technology from abroad, that they have some of the highest rates of startup, of entrepreneurial innovation of anywhere. And so many things we know today have been developed out of Scandinavia, and very often have been acquired through, say, American. Excuse me. I was hoping to last to the end of the presentation, the last slide. By American companies, sometimes for the worse. Skype was quite a good service until Microsoft bought it and mangled it, unfortunately. But we can think of a whole range of other services, for example, music streaming services and many other interesting, innovative apps and whatnot that are coming out of Sweden and Finland, for instance. Okay, so that's a story for another day, and a week's time, we will talk very specifically about the dynamism of Scandinavia. Thank you for your attention.